Hey, hello. I hope that you're doing okay. So we are going to continue our lesson. And as you can see, I've added some things to our module here. First one is actually a quick write. So if you can please be so kind as to click there, the quick write. So as I explained, we're going to do our composition book work digitally. So what I've done here is that I've made it so that it's private, okay? So what you write in there, only you and I see it, and essentially I'm looking to see that you actually do it, just like with a composition book. Are you using the space, and are you doing the work essentially? And the way I'm going to do it, so I've quantified each of these tasks as 1 point. Either you do it or you don't. But when the first notebook check comes along, which is April 4, then that's when I'm going to be looking to see that you did all the work, did the quick writes, did the DFRs, did the diary entries too. So here's the first one, because our topic is intertextuality. Ooh. So we start off with a quick write here, and it says this: a quilt is made up of smaller patches. Hip hop is made of samples from other tracks. What else is something that is made up of smaller parts? So for this one, you can, so yeah, absolutely, you're just going to hit reply. In case Canvas freaks out on you, I do recommend typing your response in a word processor and then pasting it in here, so copy and pasting it. And this is going to be at least a paragraph, and if you want to draw, you want to add something to it, cool. Then you can attach your image there. So think of other things that are made up of smaller patches. So yeah, you can pause this video and just go ahead and type your response and upload your attachment. All right, so when you are done with that, cool. Then you just did your quick write. Actually, let's see. Let's go into our intertextuality now, which is the next thing. So click here where it says intertextuality notes. Go ahead and download the document. That's our central mission control for today. All right. If we enter full screen, does my face disappear? Yeah, it seems to. Okay. Let's keep it like this then. Okay. So first of all, here is our word, intertextuality. And I don't know how many of you have heard this term before, but yeah, that's our topic. It sounds fancy, huh? Intertextuality. But if we break it apart, we look first at its prefix, which we look at inter, and it means between. If you'll recall, intra is across, inter is between. When we talk about a text, we're actually going to look at the topic of text and textual analysis a little later on into the term, but I'll give you a little preview. And a text is a constructed artifact that carries meaning. So it's like, ooh, what could that be? Well, simply put, intertextuality is a relationship formed between texts. And because this is an English composition class and we write academic essays, it's simply pointing to the fact that we are utilizing other sources to bring them into our conversation, to create a larger conversation. Who was it? Was it Isaac Newton that said, "We stand on the shoulders of giants"? Let me see. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Yeah, Isaac Newton. Right. So I like that quote. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And that fits, I'm just getting my water. That actually fits so precisely with this, because we're bringing into our conversation other sources that are preceding us. And we're creating a new work with those preceding sources. I don't know what you did for your quick write, but a cool one is maybe like something made up of Legos. They're made up of individual blocks. Another one is like our body, right? We're made up of cells and organs and so many things, right? Larger composites made up of components. So, okay, back to intertextuality. Similarly, with academic writing, the essays that we produce are indeed composites that are made up of components, in this case sources, right? And I want to give you an example. So let's pretend, okay, you're in your language arts class and you've been assigned Macbeth, the play Macbeth, as your primary source. And you're tasked with narrowing your focus, which is something that we're going to see with this first reading that we have for homework, and that is that you want to narrow your focus, hone in on an aspect. So if you recall the play Macbeth by Shakespeare, okay, so the protagonist is Macbeth, and his wife is called Lady Macbeth. How original! Anyways, there's a king called King Duncan, and Macbeth's wife gets it into her head that Macbeth should assassinate King Duncan and usurp the throne and forcefully take it over. Okay, and so she convinces Macbeth to go ahead and kill King Duncan and take over the throne through violence and force. So anyway, the interesting thing is that at the start of this, Macbeth is the one who's hesitant. He's like, "Oh, I'm not down. That doesn't sound too good." But then, and then Lady Macbeth is all for it. But later on into the play, it's actually Lady Macbeth who becomes so plagued with guilt. And in fact, there's a famous scene where she's washing her hands and she, because she's feeling that great sense of culpability, and she still sees and feels the blood of King Duncan on her hands. And so me as a student, okay, so if I was tasked with working with the primary source of the play Lady Macbeth, and I as a student was interested in exploring the descent into madness because of the sense of guilt of Lady Macbeth, and in fact, I would make that corresponding relationship of guilt as being the catalyst for insanity in Lady Macbeth, then I would make that my thesis. So this is what I could say. I could say in William Shakespeare's play Macbeth, Lady Macbeth's sense of guilt for having a hand in King Duncan's murder acts as a catalyst that ultimately leads her into a state of full madness. So again, by my making the connection of her extreme guilt as being the tipping force, the catalyst that led her into full-blown madness. So my central project would be to prove that it's because of her guilt that she goes into full-blown madness. So let's say I was interested in that aspect of this particular character. And with research in our field of composition, it's called research when we employ other sources into the conversation. So we're creating a larger conversation and bringing in other sources into the conversation. And that's precisely what intertextuality is. With that being said, so if I was tasked with finding my sources, okay, what sources would fit my thesis here, which is the main thing. You don't want tangential sources. So I would be tasked to do that. Really quick, as you can see these key terms, I keep saying the term primary source. But in this case of my example of being assigned Macbeth as the text that I'm working from to select an aspect and craft an academic essay on, then in this instance, it's the primary source. So Macbeth is a primary source. So a primary source is just an original source of information about a topic. And in this case, Macbeth. As a secondary source, if you look at this definition, is a document or recording that relates or discusses information presented elsewhere. So if in this example, I'm bringing in articles, I'm bringing in something that I pulled from a documentary, those are all secondary sources, and the primary one is Macbeth. Similarly, if you're analyzing a film, like say The Lion King, then that's your primary source, and all the other sources that you use to bolster whatever your central thesis is, and those are secondary sources. So back to our task of finding sources that will help to further flesh out this conversation, this argument that I'm pushing for, which is the fact that it's guilt in Lady Macbeth that pushes her into full-blown madness. Okay, so I could find, let's see, some ideas that come to mind. I can find an article that looks at how guilt plays itself in human psychology. So this is because, okay, even though Macbeth is a fictional play, what species is Lady Macbeth? Well, she's not an alien. She's not a polar bear. Supposedly, Lady Macbeth is a human being, right? So here's the thing. Many times, as students, we feel frazzled by the task of finding secondary sources because we feel, okay, I need to find sources that 100% deal with my thesis, with my topic. In this case, meaning, okay, I can only find sources that deal with Macbeth. No, that's not the case at all, because since I'm more specifically looking at guilt and its interrelation to madness, particularly Lady Macbeth, who's a human, then I can find an article on human psychology and what guilt does to us. So that could be one, what guilt does to us psychologically. The other article could be about what guilt does to us physiologically, so to our bodies. So one is the whole process of guilt and how it plays out psychologically in our mind, and then its response on our body physiologically. So I can introduce that, and yeah. So those would be good examples of secondary sources that I might throw into the mix, because intertextuality is really like a quilt. If we think about a quilt is made up of smaller patches, right? So in the same way, our academic essay is a composite. Our academic essay is a quilt, and our weaving and interlacing our sources are patches that we are guiding into a larger conversation. Yeah. Again, we return to Isaac Newton. We stand on the shoulders of giants. His quote there. Okay, so with that being said, when we are determining what sources to use in our essay, if it has a research component, then here's a little checklist that I like to run through before proceeding. Number one, I need to be able to answer, okay, well, what is my own writerly project or thesis in this case? In this instance, it would be, the direct connection between Lady Macbeth's guilt and then her ultimate descent into madness. Okay, so that direct relationship is what I am moving to really flesh out, right, with evidence in my sources, and and I'm adding these sources into a larger conversation, and that's my conversation, right? What I just said about there being a direct relationship between Lady Macbeth's sense of guilt and her ultimate outcome of entering a full sense of madness. Okay, so what's my own writerly project or thesis? I know it. Check. What is the writerly project or component of the outside source that aligns with my thesis? Okay, so when I'm looking at sources, like I said, don't feel that everything of the sources has to align with what it is that you're doing. Maybe if there's a chapter or a few pages that pertain to the focus of your essay, of your thesis, then cool. Then use that chunk from the text. So you need to be clear what it is that you're going to use from your source, and then that chunk that you've selected, how does that align with your own central project? How does that align with what you're trying to do, right? So in my case, I gave the example of, okay, I'd use an article on how guilt plays itself out, psychologically, and then the other one is maybe physiologically. And let's pretend even like my first example of guilt and human psychology. Maybe that could just be, even if that's just a chapter in a book that is about other things, then that's okay. I can just use that chapter. Same thing with the one about guilt in our human physiological response. So how do we respond to guilt? So if we return to our module for this week, I want to show you this. This is a paper that I wrote when I was in grad school, and exactly what we were talking about, which is understanding what your central thesis is, and then having clear in your mind what you're going to use from your selected source, and then after that, alignment, right? So how does what you have in mind from that source align with your own central project? And that's precisely what the annotated bibliography seeks to answer. So it's a way to determine, okay, these puzzle pieces that I've selected, how will they fit together into my larger project, into my larger essay? And that's why I think annotated bibliography is such a cool thing. And I'd like to give you a little bit of context. So this is an essay where it was on writing center study, so for being a writing tutor. And I had to flesh out my own teaching philosophy as a writing tutor, thus employing outside sources as well. So notice how I answer what it is that I'm going to use from this particular article, and then how it is that will align with my own central project, okay? So listen. In this short periodical article, Jeff Brooks illustrates how to be a minimalist tutor. Okay, so it's in quotation marks because it's a key term that I pulled from here. The piece develops minimalist tutoring as a method that places students in the driver's seats of their paper, so to speak. Oftentimes, tutors take so much control during a tutorial that they relay a message of authority and control, whether consciously or subconsciously. One of the practical pieces of advice that Brooks offers against this is as simple as sit beside the student, not across a desk. The implication of sitting beside the student during a tutoring session is that you're there to help and provide a situation for them to talk about their writing with you. Okay, cool. So I've already determined what I'm going to take from his article, and then which is here, from this text, what I most aim to appropriate for my own tutoring philosophy is a definitive student-centeredness. Okay, and how that's going to align with what I want to do. So I want to make the student the primary agent in the writing center session, and make the student understand that your paper has value as a piece of writing. It's worth reading and thinking about like any other piece of writing. Oftentimes, this is missing in the minds of students. Even though this minimalist type tutoring positions the student as doing the work, I still view it as a collaboration. The contribution of the tutor is creating the situation for the tutee to further reach realizations about their own work. Cool. So see how I did that? I answered all these things. I had to clear in my mind what my central project was, and then I had to clear in my mind, okay, what was I going to use for my source, and then how does that I have in mind for my source, how does that align with my central project? So I answered all that, and I had it clear, and unless you do that, then you might be stuck with a source that really is not going to serve you. It might even feel very tangential at the end of the day. And you don't want that. You want to be intentional and recognize, oh, this definitely fits my central project, which is why you really don't have your essay until you have determined what your central project is, because then you'll have direction. Yeah. So back to this whole thing that we're talking about, intertextuality, and there's a very social aspect, and this literary theorist named Kenneth Burke comes up with a really cool metaphor that translates with the work that we do with academic writing. So listen to this metaphor. He calls it the parlor metaphor. Imagine that you enter a parlor. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they're engaged in a heated discussion. A discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it's about. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there, so that no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone before. You listen for a while until you decide that you've caught the tenor of the argument. Then you put in your oar. Someone answers, you answer him. Another comes to your defense. Another aligns himself against you to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending on the quality of your ally's assistance. However, the discussion is interminable. The hour grows late, you must depart, and you do depart with the discussion still vigorously in progress. So what this translates to is that we enter a conversation that has long preceded us when we create academic essays. So in this case of our focus on Lady Macbeth's descent into madness, I'm sure that others have been talking about this as well and have explored that aspect, considering even how old the play Macbeth is, right? So it's a conversation that has preceded us, and it will actually continue even after we're long gone. I think even if you think about it more professionally too, with a more professional context, then consider a doctor, right? So first of all, medicine and science and the technology to treat patients is continually evolving. Thank God we're away from the dark ages where they'd use leeches and bleed you out and have these very strange practices. So with that being said, any doctor worth their own salt stays current on the evolution of their field, right? So they subscribe to medical journals, they attend conferences, and let's pretend you who are watching this, let's pretend that you are interested in prosthetics, okay? So you read articles, you go to conferences about prosthetics, so that translates to listening in on the conversation. What's the current discourse? What's the current conversation of prosthetics? Then you can put in your oar, which is a contribution. So potentially you could publish some articles or even present at conferences about your own evolutions in the design of prosthetics. Maybe your design is a little bit more ergonomic than a previous one. So you're building off of a conversation that has preceded you, and it will even continue after you're long gone. So it's a neat thing. It's very much an ongoing cycle. So another neat thing, guys, as academic writers, what we do with our essays is very much like what a lawyer does in a courtroom. So let's pretend that, God forbid, but let's pretend that you're being accused of tax evasion, which, by the way, make sure to pay your taxes. But anyways, let's pretend that that's what you're being accused on, and your lawyer who is defending you says their thesis, their central argument is my client is innocent of tax evasion because she actually did pay her taxes, and there just happened to be some glitch in the computer system. Okay, fine. So just like with essays and just like with thesis statements, there's that anatomy. So the topic is tax evasion. The claim is that you're innocent of tax evasion, and the direction is because you did file your taxes, there was only a glitch in the computer system. Okay, cool. So that's your central argument. So similarly, a lawyer calls witnesses to the stand. A lawyer uses exhibits, and all these things are intentional so as to help flesh out their argument. But you remember, the lawyer is the one who is guiding everything. So similarly, it's a good reminder to not hand over the microphone to your sources, because just like in the courtroom, lawyers don't say, okay, witness A, witness B, let's see what you have to say. And they don't just leave it there. Okay, court is adjourned. That's all I have to say. I rest my case. And without them guiding it, no. It has to be you who's guiding the conversation. which translates to academic writing, right? You have to guide the conversation and not just drop quotes and say, oh, okay, such and such person says X in their article, such and such person says Y in their book, such and such person says Z in their documentary. Okay, well, that's the equivalent of a lawyer handing over the mic, and not explaining, how those are interconnected and interlacing a larger conversation. So remember, don't hand over your microphones, but instead your sources are only patches that you're bringing into your quilt. But ultimately, it's you who's interlacing, who's weaving them, right? So do remember that. Okay, so it's precisely because of the fact that we bring in other sources into our work that we have to give credit where credit is due. So this is stuff that does not just come off the dome, right? I like to say, it's not your work, so you need to give credit where credit is due. So we do that by way of in-text citations, and okay, cool. So with that being said, we're going to learn about in-text citations and even how to create a works cited page. Okay, so first of all, this is funny. It's like a joke on a Hamlet. To underline or use quotation marks? That is the question. Okay, so first of all, we have we have quotation marks, and those are what are known as components. So that those are used when our source is a component, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. When we underline or italicize, so that they're interchangeable, you can underline or italicize. They mean the same thing. You're still establishing the source as a container. And here's what I mean by that. First of all, the word. So what does a container do? It contains things, right? Just like a cereal bowl contains cereal flakes when you drop it in there. So similarly with sources, a container contains components, contains smaller aspects to it. So, like for example, a film, if we talk about The Lion King, that's a container, right? If we talk about a scene in The Lion King, maybe, I don't know, a fateful meeting. Maybe that's like a scene in the movie. I just made it up, by the way. But the scene would be a component, and the entire film of Lion King would be a container. So there, same thing with a play, right? A play is a container, but a scene is a component, right? It's a part of the container. Same thing with an album. An album is a container. So when I was a kid, I used to listen to Will Smith, and one of my favorite albums was called Big Willie Style. So Big Willie Style would be underlined or italicized. I mean, you can choose. And if I were to choose a song, let's say Getting Jiggy With It, then that would be in quotation marks because that's a component. A song is a component of the container, which is the album. So one other thing that I want to talk about is just a reminder. So an article is actually considered a component because an article is typically housed in a larger publication. So whether the article is housed in a website or a journal or I don't know, an anthology, something, or a newspaper or a magazine. It's an article is housed in a larger container. Yeah. Okay, you're like, okay, Mr. Godoy, I'm getting all this, but how am I supposed to remember, when to use quotation marks and when to underline? Well, look at it this way. If you look at the appearance of a quotation mark, you'll see that it looks like little fragments of a line, right? They're little fragments of a line. So, okay, another word for a fragment or part of something larger is a component, right? Think of it that way. And then when you underline something like this line, it literally looks like a whole line, yeah? So I like to pretend, okay, if I had this line and it was fragile, I took this line, it was made of glass, I shattered it. So then I take shards of glass, okay, those are the components, and then the larger glass line, that was the container. So that's how I like to remember. So quotation marks because it looks like a fragment of a line, and that's the component, and then when I underline, then that's the container. That's the whole thing. And with italics, it's something you're going to have to memorize. So it's just know that italics and underlining are interchangeable. Okay. So how do we actually integrate outside sources into our work? Well, you need to make it clear who your source is and why it is that they're an authority figure on your topic. Yeah. So check this out. We're returning to our Macbeth example, and I'm interested in the aspect of Lady Macbeth's descent into madness. Okay, cool. So check this out. Look how I integrate it. In her article entitled, hey, now you know articles are in quotation marks because they are components of a larger container that houses them, yeah? So, in her article entitled Lady Macbeth's Descent into Madness. So here's what I mean. I'm saying who she is and how she is an authority in commenting on the topic, right? So, the Shakespeare scholar, Maria Garcia, explores the connection between Lady Macbeth's guilt over King Duncan's death and her own eventual loss of sanity. Excuse me. So I made this quote up. Whereupon, reaching a tipping point of guilt, Lady Macbeth went mad. Garcia 8. What do you notice about this? Yeah, so last name and page number. The ultimate consequence of madness is directly linked to extreme guilt. To better understand this, we simply need to look further into human psychology. Okay, so then I could plug in my source that looks at human psychology. So, two things. You'll notice that I, aside from using the correct punctuation mark instead of underlining, I use quotation marks because it's an article. But like I said, I also said how the individual is an authority figure. Like, if it's just like a random person that you meet at the bus stop, but maybe you're writing an essay on the migratory pattern of blue whales. Okay. So I would say you might want maybe to cull from the work of a marine biologist, yeah? Because a marine biologist would certainly have the knowledge base and sufficient authority to comment on something like that, the migratory patterns of blue whales, yeah? Okay, so say how they're an authority figure, or say who they are, and then say their first and last name, okay? Don't just call them by their last name at first. Don't call them by their first name only. They're not your homie. They're not your squad member. Like, say who they are, first and last name. Then afterward, you can call them by their last name after you've introduced them. Okay. So as you notice here, we had a little preview. So at the end of your citation, I just want to ask you really quick. Okay. So Garcia 10. What are we indicating there? Feel free to answer to the video. Yeah, that's right. So Garcia, last name, and page number 10. What about here? 10-12. Yes, pages 10, 11, and 12. What about here? 10, 13, 15. Yeah, pages 10, 13, and 15. And notice we have only the last name. You don't need to put the first name in at the end here. Okay. So I am going to give you the answer to 3 of your homework worksheets questions. So do pay attention. So the rationale behind the organization behind in-text citations is to always procure to avoid redundancy. Okay? So look at this. It took another century for things to be set right. Lopez 5. Okay, cool. We already know this. Look at this second one. According to Miguel Gutierrez, the majority of the factory had been left in shambles. Number 1, when we use quotation marks, it's only because we are citing something that is verbatim, that is word for word taken from a source author, right? But if you are paraphrasing the gist of what a source author is relaying, then you don't have to use quotation marks. That's only for verbatim citations. But do say the other thing you notice, it has page number, but it does not say their last name. And that's because, remember what I said, you want to avoid redundancy. So if in the same sentence you say the person's last name, you're not going to have it here at the end of at the tag at the end. So I would not say, according to Miguel Gutierrez, the majority of the factor have been left in shambles. I would not say Gutierrez too, because I've already said his last name here. So again, you want to avoid redundancy. Look at number 3. In an interview with Susan Smith, she divulged the reasoning behind her defection to Russia. Whoa! So we don't say here Smith interview because we've already said it in the same sentence. So pay attention to that. The worksheet's going to try to trick you, but I know you're not going to get tricked. Okay. Another thing, when we're bringing in sources, when we're integrating sources, I don't know if you recall to the days of grade school, but there was something called a quote sandwich, which is that rather than just dropping the quote and leaving it as such, you introduce the quote, that's the bread, maybe the ham in the middle of the quote itself, and then the bottom bread is you further fleshing out or commenting on or just impelling the conversation forward based on what you dropped. Like, again, you don't just want to hand over your mic to your witnesses. Okay, witness A has this to say, witness B has that to say, witness C has this to say. No. You're being intentional. You're introducing the quote, you're bringing in the quote, and then you're further commenting on the quote, because it's a conversation. You're impelling it forward by fleshing it out, by commenting on it, by tying it into your next point. So some suggestions and ideas. Again, call them by their last name. Don't call them by their first name. First, introduce them, first name, last. Then you can call them by their last name. And just really quick, let's open up again the 630 paper. That's from the quick write. No, what I want is, here, let's go to back. Those are the notes. Okay, here's the paper. So I'm going to maximize this. Okay, so we've been talking about this, and just pay attention to how I integrate my outside sources. Okay, so check it out. So here's my intro, yeah? Really quick, before I forget. We have talked about this, remember, but so if quotation marks have the purpose of citing a source that does not belong to you, then you do not need to use quotation marks for your own essay title, because it's your own essay title, right? Okay, cool. So remember, pay attention to how I introduce the quote, then I bring it in, then I continue commenting on it. Okay, it's a quote sandwich. So rather than being overly concerned with fixing students' papers, the praxis behind my operating as a writing tutor instead places a heavy focus on the student itself. Stephen M. North, in his article, The Idea of a Writing Center, clearly establishes the objective of the writing tutor. Our job, okay, so I put parentheses because I wanted to make the subject more clear. So WC, Writing Center. So if you add parentheses within a direct quote, then that's something that you are just further qualifying. You can do that, okay? So our job in the Writing Center is to produce better writers, not better writing. North 438. Okay, so there's the bread, there's the ham, and there's the other bread. Here I'm continuing. It's like an outro, if you will. This reasoning makes perfect sense to me and resonates deeply with my own conception of what a service like a writing tutor is supposed to be focused on. The student is at the center of this job, not just fixing their papers. Okay, so it's me who continues writing and leading it forward, just like the lawyer. I'm not handing over my mics. So check this one out. The way that I would move to clarify students' understanding of writing is predicated upon my subscription to the idea of writing as a process and to the social approach to composition and writing. That is to say that I would operate under a framework of talking out the ideas in a tutee's mind and paper. My reference to the social approach is keenly elucidated and okay, so I drop in this term because I'm intentional, because that is my transition into this source, right? That's the point of commonality in social approach and writing. So my reference to the social approach is keenly elucidated in Kenneth A. Brefait's article, Peer Tutoring and the Conversation of Mankind. Brefaит develops his approach upon the assertion that as civilized human beings, ellipses, okay, when we use an ellipses, we are omitting material, okay? So maybe there is content in your source that does not 100% align with what it is that you're trying to do, and maybe it can feel extraneous, then but absolutely include an ellipses, okay? So as civilized human beings, ellipses, so there's more in here, but we're the inheritors of a conversation, Brefait 88. Okay, there's my bread, there's my ham, here's my bread outro. Brefait makes a tacit connection between reflective thought and writing, and furthermore goes on to label them as extensions of conversation. See, another point of commonality. So reflective thought is public or social conversation internalized. Okay, so see how I'm doing that? I'm interlacing and I'm finding transitions. I'm finding points of commonality to interlacing with the next aspect of the source that I'm going to bring in. But remember, it's like a quote sandwich. Introducing it and the quote, and then some sort of outro it's you who's guiding it, who's leading the larger conversation. Because that's what your academic essay is. It's a conversation. It's a quilt. Okay. Okay, cool. So I'm going to start a new video for the Works Cited page. So